Your support means the world. Subscribe and click like. Tell me, where are you listening from? The rain hammered against the windows of Ashford Hall with such violence that Eleanor could feel the vibrations through the wooden wheels of her chair. She sat alone in the drawing room, her hands folded carefully in her lap, maintaining the posture her mother had drilled into her since childhood. A lady must always appear composed, even when her world is crumbling around her, especially then. The door opened, and Eleanor didn't need to turn to know it was another one. She could hear it in the hesitant footsteps, the cleared throat, the rustle of expensive fabric. Lord Pemberton had arrived exactly on time for tea, as a proper gentleman should. Her mother had spoken of him with such hope that morning, a widower, mature, established, surely not as foolish as the younger men who had come before. Miss Ashford. His voice was warm enough, polite. Eleanor turned her chair with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over the past 6 years, offering him her most gracious smile. He was handsome in that unremarkable way of English nobility, sandy hair, pleasant features, the confident bearing of a man who'd never known real hardship. Lord Pemberton, how kind of you to call despite this dreadful weather. She gestured to the chair across from her, noting how his eyes had already found the wheelchair, how his expression had already begun to shift. It was always the same. The initial greeting, the moment of realization, the barely concealed disappointment, and then the awkward retreat. She'd become an expert at reading the signs. He sat, but his posture was wrong, too far forward, as if preparing to leave at any moment. Her mother entered with the tea service, chattering brightly about the weather, the season, anything to fill the suffocating silence. Eleanor poured with steady hands, years of practice making the motion graceful despite the awkward angle. "I understand you've recently returned from your estates in Cornwall, my lord," Eleanor said, deploying the conversational skills that had once made her popular in ballrooms. "I've heard the coastline there is breathtaking." "Yes, quite." His responses were monosyllabic, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking escape. When Eleanor's mother excused herself, a tactical maneuver meant to give them privacy, Lord Pemberton stood so quickly, his teacup rattled. "Miss Ashford, I'm afraid I've just remembered an urgent appointment in town. Please forgive me." He was already moving toward the door, his relief palpable. "Your mother will understand, I'm sure. Good day." And he was gone, just like that, just like all the others. Eleanor sat in the silence that followed, the untouched tea growing cold on the table between the empty chairs. She'd stopped crying over these rejections years ago. What good did tears do? They changed nothing. She was still Eleanor Ashford, the Colonel's crippled daughter, the girl who'd broken her back falling from her horse at 12 years old and would never walk again. No amount of breeding, beauty, or accomplishment could erase that single defining fact. The door burst open, and her father strode in, his military bearing as rigid as ever despite his retirement. Colonel Ashford had faced enemy fire without flinching, but the sight of his daughter in her wheelchair still brought a tightness to his jaw. "He's gone, then?" "Yes, father." Eleanor kept her voice level. "An urgent appointment," he said. Coward. Her father poured himself a generous whiskey, despite the early hour. The lot of them. No backbone, no honor. They simply want a wife who can dance with them, who can walk beside them in society, who can— Eleanor stopped, hating the bitterness that crept into her voice. They want what anyone would want. A whole wife. "You are whole, Eleanor." Her father's voice was fierce, and she loved him for it even as she knew it wasn't true. Not in the eyes of the world that mattered. Any man would be lucky to have you. "Then why does no one want me?" The question escaped before she could stop it, raw and painful. 6 years. 6 years of rejections, of pitying looks, of becoming invisible at every social gathering. The tragic Miss Ashford, wheeled into corners and forgotten. Beautiful enough to attract attention, damaged enough to ensure it never lasted. Her father's expression crumbled, and for a moment he looked old, tired, defeated. "Eleanor, my dear, I need to speak with you about something. Something serious." He drained his whiskey in one swallow. "We're ruined." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "What?" "The investments I made last year, the ones Hartley assured me were sound. They've collapsed entirely. The railway company went bankrupt. I've lost everything." He couldn't meet her eyes. "The estate is mortgaged to its limit. We have debts I cannot possibly repay. Unless something changes, we'll lose Ashford Hall within 6 months." Eleanor's mind raced. Ashford Hall had been in their family for generations. Her mother's entire identity was wrapped up in being mistress of this house, in her position in society. Her younger sisters, still in the schoolroom, had no other prospects if the family fell into disgrace. What can we do? I've explored every option, called in every favor, but there's only one man willing to help us. Her father's hands clenched into fists. The Duke of Blackmore has made an offer. The name sent a chill through Eleanor. Everyone knew of the Duke of Blackmore, the scarred recluse who rarely came to London, whose estate in the north was spoken of in whispers. They said he'd killed a man in a duel over an insult. They said his temper was legendary, that servants fled his employ regularly. They said his first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, though that was probably just gossip. Still, his reputation was dark enough that polite society kept its distance. What kind of offer? But Eleanor already knew. Her stomach turned with the certainty of it. He's offered to clear all our debts, provide a generous settlement for your mother and sisters, and secure your sisters' dowries. In exchange, her father's voice broke, in exchange he wants to marry you. The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. Why? Why would a duke want to marry me? He could have anyone. I don't know. Her father finally looked at her, and the guilt in his eyes was devastating. I don't know his reasons, Eleanor, but he was very clear. He wants you specifically, and his offer is extraordinarily generous. More than generous. It would save us completely. And if I refuse? Silence. They both knew the answer. If she refused, her entire family would be destroyed. Her mother would be cast into poverty. Her sisters would have no prospects, no futures. All because of her father's failed investments. But the weight of saving them would fall on Eleanor's shoulders. The unwanted daughter, finally useful for something. When does he expect an answer? Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking. He's given us 1 week to consider, but Eleanor... Her father moved closer, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture that cost his military pride dearly. I cannot ask this of you. I won't force you. If you say no, we'll find another way somehow. Eleanor looked at her father's weathered face, thought of her mother's tears when she'd learned of their financial ruin, imagined her bright, laughing sisters suddenly impoverished and unmarriageable. She thought of all the men who'd rejected her, all the years of being unwanted and invisible. At least this way, her existence would matter. She could save her family. It was perhaps the only valuable thing she could do. Tell the Duke I accept his proposal, she said quietly. I'll marry him. The wedding was arranged with shocking speed, 3 weeks from acceptance to ceremony, as if the Duke feared she might change her mind. Eleanor suspected he simply wanted the transaction completed efficiently, the way one might finalize a business deal. She was a solution to her family's problem, and whatever problem he needed solved. Nothing more. She saw him only once before the wedding, when he came to Ashford Hall to discuss the arrangements. Eleanor had positioned herself by the window in the front parlour, determined to see him arrive. The carriage that rolled up the drive was black and imposing, pulled by 4 perfectly matched horses. When the Duke stepped out, Eleanor's breath caught. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered and powerful in his dark coat. But it was his face that held her attention. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling slightly at the corner of his eye. His features were harsh, uncompromising, the face of a man who'd seen violence and perhaps enjoyed it. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and when he looked up at the house, his expression was so cold that Eleanor felt ice in her veins. This was the man she would marry, this stranger with the cruel face and the dark reputation. This man who would have complete control over her life, her body, her future. Their meeting was brief and formal. The Duke barely looked at her. His attention focused on her father as they discussed settlements and legal arrangements. When he finally did turn to Eleanor, his dark eyes swept over her with an unreadable expression. She couldn't tell if he saw a woman or simply an object he'd purchased. Miss Ashford. His voice was deep, rough. I trust the arrangements are satisfactory to you. What a ridiculous question. As if she had any choice. Yes, Your Grace, thank you for your generosity to my family. Something flickered in his eyes. Was it amusement? Anger? She couldn't tell. The ceremony will be held at Blackmore Manor. I'll send a carriage for you in 2 weeks. Come prepared to stay. He turned back to her father without waiting for her response, as if she'd already been dismissed. When he left, Eleanor felt as if she could breathe again. Her mother found her still sitting by the window, watching the black carriage disappear down the drive. He seems quite formidable, her mother said carefully, using the word that meant frightening without saying it directly. Yes. Eleanor's hands were shaking slightly. She clasped them together in her lap. Quite formidable indeed. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. A wedding dress was made, though Eleanor insisted on something simple. What was the point of elaborate lace and embroidery for a marriage that was merely a transaction? Her mother tried to make it festive, tried to pretend this was a normal wedding, but the sadness in her eyes betrayed her. On the morning of her departure, Eleanor's sisters came to say goodbye. Alice, at 14, still believed in romance and happy endings. "Perhaps he'll be kind," she whispered, hugging Eleanor tightly. "Perhaps it won't be so bad." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, though she believed no such thing. Men who were kind didn't have reputations like the Duke of Blackmore's. Men who were kind didn't purchase unwanted brides to solve mysterious problems. The journey to Blackmore Manor took 2 days. The Duke had sent an elaborate carriage equipped with every possible comfort, including modifications that made it easier for Eleanor to manage. A lady's maid travelled with her, a quiet older woman named Mrs. Thorne, who'd been sent from Blackmore ahead of time. "Have you served the Duke long?" Eleanor asked on the first day, desperate for any information about the man she was travelling to marry. Mrs. Thorne's expression remained neutral. 10 years, miss. His Grace is a fair employer. They say he has a terrible temper. His Grace expects high standards, miss. Some find that difficult." It was a careful answer, revealing nothing. Eleanor tried several more times to draw the woman out, but Mrs. Thorne was clearly loyal to her employer and wouldn't gossip. Eleanor couldn't decide if that was admirable or terrifying. As they travelled north, the landscape grew more dramatic. Rolling hills gave way to wilder country, and the air grew colder. Eleanor had never been this far from home before. Everything felt foreign and vaguely threatening, as if she were being carried away from everything familiar into some dark fairy tale. The first sight of Blackmore Manor stole what little courage Eleanor had left. It rose from the moorland like something out of a Gothic novel, all dark stone and towering walls and narrow windows that gleamed like watching eyes. The main structure was ancient, clearly medieval in origin, though newer wings had been added over the centuries. It should have been magnificent, but instead it felt oppressive, as if the weight of centuries was pressing down on it. The carriage rolled through massive iron gates and up a long drive lined with bare trees. It was late afternoon, and the dying light cast long shadows across the grounds. Eleanor could see formal gardens, though they looked austere in the autumn chill. Beyond the manor, the moors stretched endlessly, purple and grey under a sky heavy with clouds. When the carriage stopped before the main entrance, Eleanor took a deep breath. This was her wedding day. In a few hours she would be the Duchess of Blackmore, bound forever to a man she didn't know and frankly feared. There was no escape, no alternative, no rescue coming. She would have to be brave, even if it killed her. The door opened and a footman appeared, followed immediately by Mrs. Thorne. "Come, miss, let me help you." Getting out of carriages was always an ordeal, one that Eleanor had learned to endure with as much dignity as possible. The footman brought her wheelchair from where it had been secured, and Mrs. Thorne helped her transfer into it efficiently. Eleanor was grateful that the woman didn't fuss or make a production of it. Some servants seemed to think excessive sympathy was helpful. It never was. The entrance hall of Blackmore Manor was vast and intimidating. Dark wood panelling, heavy tapestries, portraits of stern ancestors staring down from the walls. A massive staircase dominated the center of the hall, curving up into shadows. Everything spoke of age, wealth, power, and a certain grim austerity that matched the Duke's reputation perfectly. A thin, elderly man in butler's livery approached and bowed. "Miss Ashford, welcome to Blackmore Manor. I am Hertford, His Grace's butler. The Duke is waiting for you in the chapel. If you'll follow me." Eleanor's heart hammered as Hertford led her through a series of corridors. The manor was a maze of passages and rooms, all furnished with heavy, dark furniture that probably hadn't been updated in decades. Everything was impeccably clean, but felt cold, unlived in, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The chapel was in the oldest part of the manor, a small stone room with narrow windows and an air of ancient solemnity. A priest waited at the altar, looking uncomfortable, and there, standing with his back to the door, was the Duke. He turned as she entered, and Eleanor's breath caught again at the sight of him. He was dressed formally in black, the scar on his face even more prominent in the candlelight. His expression was as cold and unreadable as it had been at Ashford Hall. This was her groom, this stranger who looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a woman he was about to marry. "Miss Ashford." He didn't smile, didn't move to greet her. "Shall we proceed?" No words of welcome. No pretense of warmth. Eleanor straightened her spine and met his gaze directly. If he expected her to cower or weep, he would be disappointed. She'd agreed to this marriage to save her family, and she would see it through with whatever dignity she could maintain. "Yes, Your Grace, I'm ready." The ceremony was brutally brief. No guests, no music, no celebration. Just the priest's droning voice in the cold stone chapel, the Duke's deep tones as he made his vows without inflection, and Eleanor's own voice, surprisingly steady, as she promised to love, honor, and obey a man she knew nothing about. When the priest pronounced them married, the Duke took her hand, his touch impersonal, his skin warm against hers, and brushed his lips across her knuckles in the barest acknowledgement of the kiss required to seal their union. Then he released her and turned to the priest to sign the register. It was done. Eleanor Ashford no longer existed. In her place was Eleanor Blackmore, Duchess of Blackmore, bound forever to a man who seemed to regard her with less warmth than he might show a piece of furniture. Hertford reappeared to lead them to dinner. The Duke walked ahead without offering to help with her chair, without looking back to see if she was following. Eleanor pushed herself after him, determined not to show how his coldness stung. She'd expected nothing from this marriage. She had no right to feel disappointed. The dining room was as oppressive as the rest of the house. Long, dark, dominated by a table that could easily seat 30. Place settings had been arranged at one end, the Duke at the head of the table and Eleanor to his right. Servants brought course after course of excellent food that Eleanor could barely taste. The Duke ate in silence, his attention on his plate, and made no attempt at conversation. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Eleanor spoke. "Your home is very impressive, Your Grace." He looked up, seeming almost surprised that she'd spoken. "It's old. Most of it dates from the 14th century. It must have been in your family for generations." "Yes." He returned his attention to his food, clearly considering the conversation finished. Eleanor tried again, refusing to sit through the entire meal in silence. "I understand Blackmore is quite remote. Do you often travel to London?" "Rarely. I dislike the city." Another monosyllabic response, delivered without looking at her. "I see. And your estates, are they extensive?" "Yes." He set down his fork with a sharp click that made her flinch. "Miss Ashford, forgive me, I should say Your Grace now. If you're hoping for pleasant conversation and social niceties, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. I'm not a man who enjoys idle chatter." The words were brutal in their honesty, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was merely trying to be polite, Your Grace. Politeness isn't necessary between us. This marriage is a practical arrangement, nothing more. You needn't pretend otherwise." He stood abruptly. "You must be tired from your journey. Hertford will show you to your chambers. Good night." And he was gone, striding from the room without a backward glance, leaving Eleanor alone at the enormous table with half a dozen servants pretending not to have witnessed her humiliation. She sat very still, fighting back the tears that threatened. A practical arrangement. That's all she was to him. All she would ever be. The unwanted bride, purchased to satisfy some need she didn't understand, and clearly not worth even basic courtesy. Hertford materialized at her elbow, his expression carefully neutral, but not unkind. "If you'll follow me, Your Grace, I'll show you to your chambers." The title sounded strange applied to her. Your Grace, Duchess of Blackmore. All the rank and privilege in the world couldn't change what she was, an unwanted cripple married to a man who could barely stand to look at her. Hertford led her through more corridors, up a different route than the main staircase. She noticed there was a gentle ramp instead of steps, carefully integrated into the architecture. Her chambers were in the east wing, Hertford explained. The Duke's were in the west. As far apart as possible within the house, she noted. Even in his own home he wanted distance from her. But when Hertford opened the door to her suite, Eleanor gasped. The rooms were beautiful. Not in the dark, oppressive way of the rest of the manor, but bright and welcoming. The walls were painted a soft cream, and the furniture, while still expensive and well-made, was lighter in color and style. A fire roared in the hearth, filling the space with warmth. But it wasn't just the decoration that shocked her. Everything had been modified for her wheelchair. The doorways were wider than standard. The bed was lower than usual, positioned so she could transfer to it easily. There was a sitting area with a table at exactly the right height for her to work comfortably. Even the windows had been positioned so she could see out while seated. In the adjoining bathing room, she could see a specially designed tub with rails and a seat, clearly built to accommodate her needs. "His Grace had the chambers renovated before your arrival," Hertford said quietly. "He was very specific about the requirements." Eleanor couldn't speak. She rolled slowly through the rooms, taking in every thoughtful detail. This wasn't the work of a man who saw her as merely a practical arrangement. This was the work of someone who'd thought carefully about what she would need, who'd anticipated problems she herself might not have considered. The Duke had done this. The cold, cruel Duke who couldn't bear to speak to her at dinner had spent significant time and money making these rooms perfect for her. "I don't understand," she whispered. Hartford's expression softened slightly. "His Grace can be difficult to understand, Your Grace, but he is not unkind. Never unkind." He moved to the door. "Mrs. Thorne will be along shortly to help you prepare for bed. If you need anything, there's a bell pull by your bed. Good night, Your Grace." When she was alone, Eleanor sat by the window, looking out over the dark moors. Her wedding night. She'd been dreading what might happen, the consummation that was a husband's right. But the Duke had made it clear he wouldn't be coming to her chambers. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt confused and strangely hurt. Who was the Duke of Blackmore? The cold man who couldn't speak a kind word to her, or the thoughtful one who'd built her perfect rooms? The cruel nobleman of reputation, or the man who employed servants who spoke of him with quiet loyalty? Eleanor touched her ring, a heavy gold band set with sapphires that the Duke had slid onto her finger during the ceremony, without ceremony or comment. She was married now, bound to this mysterious, contradictory man, and she had absolutely no idea what her future would hold. The first days of marriage passed in a strange, isolated rhythm. Eleanor saw the Duke only at dinner, and those meals were exercises in uncomfortable silence. He would eat quickly, answer her attempts at conversation with monosyllables, and then excuse himself as soon as possible. The rest of the time he seemed to deliberately avoid her, spending his days locked away in his study or riding out across the moors alone. Eleanor explored her new home as best she could. Blackmore Manor was vast, and much of it was difficult for her to access, despite the modifications made to her chambers. The main floors had some ramps and wider doorways, but the upper floors and many of the older sections remained inaccessible. Still, there was enough to keep her occupied: a beautiful library, a music room with a pianoforte, formal gardens that she could manage in her wheelchair. The servants were polite but distant, clearly unsure how to treat her. She was the Duchess now, technically the mistress of the household, but she had no idea how to manage an estate this size. Her mother had run Ashford Hall with effortless efficiency, but Eleanor had never expected to need those skills. Who would marry a crippled girl? She thought she'd live quietly with her family forever, perhaps helping with her sister's children someday. Mrs. Thorne became her closest companion, though the older woman maintained proper boundaries. She helped Eleanor dress and undress, managed her bath, and occasionally shared information about the household. But she wouldn't gossip about the Duke, wouldn't explain his behavior or his reputation. "His Grace is a private man, Your Grace," was all she would say. "He has his reasons for everything he does." A week into the marriage, Eleanor woke to find it had snowed during the night. The moors were transformed, covered in white that sparkled in the weak morning sun. For a moment she forgot where she was and why, caught up in the beauty of it. Then reality crashed back. She was the unwanted Duchess, married to a man who could barely stand to be in the same room with her. She spent the morning in the library, trying to lose herself in a book, but her attention kept drifting to the window, to the snow-covered landscape. She'd always loved winter, loved the transformation that came with the first snowfall. Before her accident, she would have been outside immediately, perhaps convincing her father to take her riding through the fresh powder. "Your Grace?" Hertford appeared in the doorway. "His Grace requests your presence in the East Garden." Eleanor's heart jumped. The Duke requesting her presence? That was new. "Of course. I'll come at once." She followed Hertford through corridors she was still learning, out through a side door she hadn't discovered yet, and there, in what proved to be a formal rose garden, now sleeping under snow, was the Duke. But it wasn't the garden that made Eleanor's breath catch. It was the wheelchair waiting beside him. Not her regular chair, this was something else entirely. Sleeker, with larger wheels that looked designed for outdoor use. And the wheels themselves had strange attachments, almost like small paddles. The Duke turned as she approached, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Your chair won't work well in snow. I had this made. The wheel attachments can be added when needed for difficult terrain." Eleanor stared at the modified wheelchair, then at the Duke. "You had this made?" "When?" "I commissioned it before we married. It was delivered yesterday." He gestured at it impatiently. "Well, try it." She transferred into the new chair and immediately felt the difference. It was better balanced, more comfortable. When she pushed forward, even through the snow-dusted path, the wheels gripped properly. The Duke had somehow created a wheelchair that could handle winter terrain. The gardens have been modified as well, he continued, as if discussing something mundane rather than something that changed Eleanor's entire world. The paths are wider and properly graded. You should be able to access most of the grounds now, even in snow. Why? The question burst from Eleanor before she could stop it. Why would you do this? For the first time since their wedding, something shifted in the Duke's cold expression. Surprise, perhaps, or was it confusion? Because you'll want to go outside. The weather is often severe here. Your normal chair wouldn't suffice. But you... Eleanor struggled to articulate the contradiction. You can barely speak to me. You avoid me constantly. Yet you do things like this. I don't understand you at all. The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Eleanor feared she'd angered him. Then he said, his voice rough, I'm not good at social pleasantries, conversation, the things people expect from polite society. It doesn't come naturally to me. He gestured sharply at the wheelchair. This I can do. Making things work properly, solving practical problems. This I understand. It was the longest speech he'd given her since their wedding, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't avoiding her because he found her repulsive. He was simply awkward, uncomfortable with the social aspects of their relationship, and trying to show care in the only way he knew how. Thank you, she said softly. It's incredibly thoughtful. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. He turned away, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Hartford will have someone accompany you if you wish to explore. The grounds are safe. He was leaving again, escaping before the conversation could become too personal. But Eleanor called after him, Your Grace, would you show me the gardens yourself, if you have time? The Duke stopped, his back to her, and Eleanor held her breath. She'd pushed too far, asked for too much. He would refuse, and she would be left alone again with only servants for company. Then he turned back, and though his expression remained stern, he gave a single nod. Very well, follow me. He led her through the gardens, and though he wasn't eloquent, he did speak, pointing out different plants sleeping under the snow, mentioning modifications he'd made to the landscaping, occasionally stopping to ensure she was managing the terrain. It wasn't comfortable conversation, wasn't the easy chatter she'd once shared with friends at parties in London, but it was something, an offering of sorts, extended by a man who clearly found such interactions difficult. When they reached a viewpoint overlooking the moors, the Duke stopped. The vista was breathtaking, miles of white expanse broken only by dark patches of heather, the sky enormous overhead. I grew up here, the Duke said suddenly. My father preferred London, but I always loved Blackmoor, the isolation, the wildness of it. Most people find it oppressive. It's beautiful, Eleanor said honestly, and it was. Harsh and unforgiving perhaps, but beautiful in its austerity. Rather like the Duke himself, she realized. There was something magnificent in the uncompromising nature of both the landscape and the man. The Duke looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt the intensity of his dark gaze like a physical touch. You're not what I expected, he said quietly. What did you expect? Resentment, fear, anger at being forced into this marriage. His eyes searched her face. You should be furious. Any woman would be. Eleanor considered this. I was angry, at first, but you saved my family from ruin. And you've been... She gestured at the modified garden paths, the special wheelchair. Oh, you've been kinder than you needed to be. Kinder than I expected, given your reputation. Something dark flickered across his face. My reputation. Yes. What have you heard? That you're cruel. That you have a terrible temper. That your first wife died under mysterious circumstances. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. That you killed a man in a duel. All true, he said flatly. The admission shocked her. All of it? I have a temper. I can be cruel when provoked. My first wife did die, though there was nothing mysterious about it. She had a fever that the doctors couldn't break. And yes, I killed a man in a duel. His expression was like stone. He insulted my mother's memory in a club, loudly and publicly, said vile things about her. I called him out. He died. I don't regret it. Eleanor absorbed this, trying to reconcile the man before her with the confession. And the cruelty? The terrible temper? I don't suffer fools or incompetence. I have high standards and little patience for those who fail to meet them. Some people interpret that as cruelty. He paused. And yes, when truly angered, I can be vicious. I don't deny it. Have I angered you? Eleanor asked. Is that why you avoid me? No. The word was sharp, emphatic. You haven't angered me. I avoid you because I don't know how to be around you. I don't know how to make pleasant conversation or be charming. I'm not good at the things husbands are supposed to do." The vulnerability in his admission surprised Eleanor. Here was the fearsome Duke of Blackmore, admitting to social inadequacy as if it were a failing. "Perhaps we could both stop trying to be what we're supposed to be," she suggested carefully. "Perhaps we could simply try to be honest with each other instead." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor wondered what he saw, the crippled girl he'd purchased, or something else. "Honest," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Very well. Honestly, I don't know how to be married. My first marriage was brief. Maria died only 8 months after our wedding, and we barely knew each other. I don't know how to share my life with someone. I don't know how to be anything other than solitary." "Then we'll learn together," Eleanor said, surprised by her own boldness. "I don't know how to be married either. I never expected to be. We can figure it out as we go." For the first time since she'd met him, the Duke smiled. It was small, barely there, and gone almost immediately, but it transformed his harsh face, made him look younger, more human. "An unusual proposal from my unusual wife. Very well. We'll try honesty." They stayed in the gardens for another hour, and though the conversation remained halting and awkward, it felt like progress. The Duke told her about the estate, about his tenants, and the improvements he'd been making to their cottages. Eleanor talked about her family, about her sisters and how much she missed them already. It wasn't easy, and there were long silences, but it was more than they'd shared since the wedding. When they finally returned to the manor, Eleanor was exhausted, but oddly hopeful. Perhaps this marriage wouldn't be the misery she'd feared. Perhaps, given time, they might even become friends. That night at dinner, something had shifted. The Duke was still not talkative, but he no longer treated conversation as an imposition. He asked her about her day, told her about a problem with one of the tenant farms he'd been working to resolve. When she mentioned missing her pianoforte playing, her instrument at Ashford Hall had been dear to her, he mentioned that the music room was at her disposal. "Though the instrument here may need tuning," he added. "No one's played it in years. I'll have someone come from the village." "You don't play?" Eleanor asked. "No, I have no talent for music." He paused. "My mother did, though. She played beautifully. She used to say that music was civilization's greatest achievement, the thing that separated us from barbarians." It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned something personal, something from his past. Eleanor felt the fragile connection between them strengthen slightly. "My mother says music is food for the soul. When I feel lost or sad, playing always helps me find my way back." The Duke nodded slowly. "Then you should play, whenever you wish. I would like to hear you, if you're willing." "Not now," he added quickly, as if worried she'd think he was demanding a performance. "But sometime, if you want to." "I'd like that," Eleanor said softly, and she meant it. After dinner, instead of fleeing immediately, the Duke walked with her to the library. He didn't stay, that would have been too much progress for one day, but the gesture felt significant. When he bid her good night, he actually looked at her, held her gaze for a moment before turning away. "Thank you," Eleanor called after him, "for today, for the gardens and the chair and for talking with me." He paused at the door. "You're my wife. I should do far more for you than provide wheelchairs and stilted conversation." "It's a start," Eleanor said. The Duke looked back at her, and again that ghost of a smile appeared. "Yes, I suppose it is." Over the following weeks, a tentative rhythm developed. The Duke began joining Eleanor for breakfast as well as dinner. He showed her more of the estate, took her to visit some of the tenant farms in a specially modified carriage. He was careful to explain things to her, to include her in his thoughts about improvements and plans, treating her as a partner rather than an ornamental wife to be kept in the house. Eleanor discovered that beneath the harsh exterior, the Duke was deeply principled. He took his responsibilities to his tenants seriously, spent significant time and money ensuring they had proper housing and support. When one of the farmers fell ill, the Duke personally ensured the family had enough to eat through the winter. When a cottage roof collapsed, he had it repaired within days. "Why do people think you're cruel?" Eleanor asked one afternoon, as they returned from inspecting a new drainage system the Duke had commissioned. "Everything I've seen suggests you care deeply about people's welfare." "I'm cruel to people who deserve it," the Duke replied. "The incompetent, the dishonest, those who take advantage of others' weakness. I have no patience for such people, and I don't hide my contempt. That makes me unpopular in certain circles. And the servants who supposedly flee your employment? I've dismissed several servants over the years for laziness or theft. Apparently being unwilling to tolerate incompetence makes me a tyrant." He shrugged. I don't particularly care what people think of me. Eleanor studied his profile as he drove the carriage. I think you care more than you admit. Otherwise, why mention your mother's opinion of music? Why tell me about the duel? The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then, perhaps you're right. Perhaps I care what you think of me, at least. I'm not sure why that should matter, but it does. The admission warmed Eleanor more than it probably should have. This difficult, complicated man cared about her opinion. It wasn't love. They barely knew each other. But it was something. A foundation, perhaps, on which more could be built. That evening, Eleanor finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her since their wedding. They were in the library. She, with a book she wasn't really reading. He, reviewing estate papers. The fire crackled in the hearth and outside snow was falling again, visible through the tall windows. Why did you marry me? The words came out more abruptly than she'd intended. Please, I need to know. You could have married anyone. Why choose me specifically? The Duke set down his papers and looked at her for a long time. In the firelight, the scar on his face seemed less harsh, more like a mark of survival. That's a complicated question. I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor said, gesturing at her wheelchair with dark humor. I have time for complicated answers. A flicker of something, amusement, approval, crossed his face. Very well. The truth is, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I needed a wife, for practical reasons. Heirs, social obligations, the running of the household. But I didn't want the usual arrangement. I didn't want some young society girl who would expect romance and attention and constant social events. I didn't want someone who would try to change me, or reform me, or make me into the charming gentleman I'm not. Eleanor's chest tightened. So it was exactly what he'd said at their wedding dinner. A practical arrangement, nothing more. She kept her expression neutral, refusing to show how much the confirmation stung. But the Duke wasn't finished. When your father's situation came to my attention, I saw an opportunity. You needed to marry for your family's sake, not for love or ambition. You wouldn't have the same expectations other women might have. And your condition meant you would be content with a quiet life here at Blackmore, rather than wanting to be dragged to London for the season. So you married me because I'm crippled and desperate. How flattering. The bitterness escaped despite Eleanor's attempt to control it. No. The word was sharp enough to make her look up. The Duke had risen from his chair and was pacing. A habit she'd learned meant he was agitated. That's not what I meant. Damn it. I'm explaining this badly. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I married you because I thought we could have a practical arrangement, yes, but also because when I made inquiries about you, everyone said the same thing, that you were kind, patient, that despite your accident and all the rejections you'd faced, you remained gracious and compassionate, that you treated servants well, that you were intelligent and accomplished and wasted in your father's home simply because society couldn't see past your wheelchair. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. I married you because I thought you deserved better than to be overlooked and pitied for the rest of your life, and because I thought that perhaps we could have something honest between us. No pretense, no games, no false romance, just mutual respect and companionship. Eleanor didn't know what to say. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it wasn't the cold calculation she'd feared either. He'd chosen her deliberately, thoughtfully, and for reasons that actually had to do with her as a person, not just as a solution to a problem. And has it been? She asked quietly. What you hoped for? The Duke returned to his chair, his expression softening slightly. I don't know yet, but I think it might be. You're not what I expected, Eleanor. You're stronger than I anticipated, braver. You challenge me, which no one else dares to do. I find that I enjoy our conversations, awkward as they sometimes are. I find that I think about you during the day, wonder what you're doing, whether you're comfortable, whether you're happy here. Her name, he'd called her Eleanor, not Your Grace, or Miss Ashford. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her heart beat faster. I think about you too, she admitted. I find myself watching for you, listening for your voice. I'm disappointed when you don't join me for meals. When you showed me the gardens, when you commissioned that wheelchair, those gestures meant more to me than you probably know. They looked at each other across the library, and something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The potential for something more than either of them had expected. May I ask you something? The Duke said, his voice rougher than usual. What happened? Your accident? You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not, but I'd like to know. Eleanor took a breath. She didn't talk about the accident often. It was too painful, too defining. But he'd been honest with her. She could offer the same. I was 12. We had a new horse, a gelding my father had bought at auction. Beautiful animal, but skittish. Everyone told me not to ride him alone, that he needed more training, but I was stubborn. I thought I was a good enough rider to handle him. She could still remember that day with perfect clarity. The smell of the stables, the excitement of saddling the horse by herself, the feeling of triumph as she'd ridden out across the fields. Something startled him. A rabbit, I think. He bolted. I tried to control him, but I was too small, not strong enough. He threw me. The Duke's expression had gone very still, very focused, as if he were imagining every detail. I don't remember the fall itself. I just remember waking up and not being able to move my legs. The doctors said my back was broken. They said I would never walk again, and I never have. Eleanor kept her voice steady, factual, as if recounting someone else's story. My father blamed himself for buying the horse. My mother blamed herself for not watching me more carefully. My sisters were terrified. Everything changed after that day. But not you, the Duke said quietly. You didn't change. Of course I changed. I had to learn to live in a completely different way, to accept that half of what I'd expected from life was gone. Walking, dancing, riding, all gone. And the marriage prospects, the children I'd have, the normal life I'd imagined. Eleanor met his eyes. But I decided I wouldn't let it destroy me. I couldn't walk, but I could still read, still play music, still think and feel and exist. I refused to become invisible just because society wanted to forget I existed. The Duke rose and crossed to her wheelchair, kneeling beside it so they were at eye level. The gesture was startling. The proud Duke of Blackmore kneeling. You're the bravest person I've ever met, he said, his voice intense. Do you know that? Facing every day with that kind of courage, refusing to give up or give in. You shame me with your strength. I don't feel brave, Eleanor whispered. Most days I just feel tired. That's what bravery is. Continuing when you're tired, fighting when it would be easier to surrender. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. I chose well when I married you, Eleanor. Better than I knew. And I'm beginning to think I may have chosen well too, Eleanor said, managing a small smile. Despite the terrifying reputation and the tendency to flee from conversations, he laughed, an actual laugh, short but genuine. The sound transformed his face completely, and Eleanor realized with a start that he was handsome. Not in the conventional way of London dandies, but in a rough, uncompromising way that suited him. I'll try to flee less often. I'd appreciate that. He stood, but didn't immediately release her hand. Eleanor, I want you to know, you can ask me for anything. Anything you need or want. This is your home now. I want you to be happy here. I am happy, Eleanor said, and realized it was true. Happier than I expected to be. You've given me more freedom and consideration than I've had in years. More than many women with full use of their legs ever receive from their husbands. That's a depressingly low bar, the Duke said dryly, but he looked pleased nonetheless. That night, lying in her bed with moonlight streaming through the windows, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. She'd come to Blackmore expecting misery, and had found instead, what? Not love, certainly, but respect, kindness, the foundation of something that might someday become more. The Duke was a complicated man, harsh and tender by turns, socially awkward but thoughtful, fierce and gentle. Understanding him would take time, but Eleanor found she wanted that time, wanted to learn his moods, his thoughts, his hidden depths, wanted to see what else might bloom between them given patience and honesty. For the first time since her accident, Eleanor felt that her life might hold possibilities beyond mere survival, perhaps even happiness, perhaps even eventually, something like love. The morning sun transformed Blackmore Manor into something almost beautiful. Eleanor woke to light streaming through her windows, painting the walls gold. It was one of those rare winter days when the sky was brilliantly clear and the snow-covered moors sparkled like diamonds scattered across fabric. She dressed with Mrs. Thorne's help, choosing a deep blue gown that the Duke had once mentioned, brought out her eyes. Not that she was trying to please him, Eleanor told herself. It was simply a lovely dress, and why shouldn't she wear it? At breakfast, the Duke was already seated, reading correspondence. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. Warmth, actual warmth in those dark eyes. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was softer than usual. "You look well. Thank you. The weather is glorious today." Eleanor maneuvered her chair to her usual place, and a servant immediately brought her tea exactly as she liked it. She'd stopped being surprised by the staff's attentiveness. The Duke clearly demanded excellence in all things, including service. "I thought you might like to visit the village today," the Duke said, setting aside his letters. "There's a market, and you haven't seen any of Blackmoor beyond the estate yet. Unless you'd prefer to stay here." The invitation surprised and delighted her. "I'd love to see the village, if you're certain you have time." "I'm making time." He stood. "We'll leave within the hour. Dress warmly. It's cold despite the sunshine." The village of Blackmoor was smaller than Eleanor had expected, a cluster of stone buildings huddled in a valley. But it was charming in its austerity, with smoke rising from chimneys and people going about their daily business despite the winter chill. The Duke's carriage, the modified one he'd commissioned for her, rolled through the narrow streets, drawing curious looks from villagers who clearly weren't accustomed to seeing their Duke with his new Duchess. At the market, the Duke helped Eleanor from the carriage himself, his hands careful and sure as he assisted her transfer to the wheelchair. Then, to her astonishment, he pushed her chair himself rather than allowing a servant to do so. "You don't have to," Eleanor started. "I know," he interrupted. "I want to." They moved through the market stalls together, the Duke introducing Eleanor to merchants and villagers with a formality that gradually eased into something more comfortable. She watched him interact with his people and saw a different side of him emerge, still stern, but fair and genuinely interested in their welfare. "Your Grace," an elderly woman called, approaching with a basket of preserves. "I wanted to thank you for the new roof. My grandson says it doesn't leak at all now." "Mrs. Hadley?" The Duke inclined his head. "It was long overdue. How is Thomas's arm healing?" "Much better, Your Grace. The doctor you sent was wonderful." After the woman left, Eleanor looked up at her husband with new eyes. "You paid for her roof and her grandson's doctor. Her cottage is on my land. It's my responsibility." He said it as if it were obvious, as if all landlords took such personal interest in their tenants' welfare. Eleanor knew from her father's estate that most did not. They continued through the market, and at every stall, Eleanor saw evidence of the Duke's care for his people, not charity exactly, but genuine investment in their well-being. A new school he'd funded, a bridge he'd had built to make the main road safer. Small things and large, all adding up to a picture of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. "You're staring," the Duke said, not looking at her. "I'm just realizing how little I knew about you when we married. You knew my reputation. That should have been enough to terrify you." "Your reputation is wrong," Eleanor said firmly, "or at least incomplete. You're not cruel. You're exacting, perhaps. Demanding, but not cruel." The Duke stopped walking, stopped pushing her chair, and stood very still. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You see me more clearly than anyone else ever has. Perhaps because I'm not afraid of you. You should be. I can be terrible when angered." Eleanor reached back and caught his hand where it rested on her wheelchair. "Then I'll try not to anger you." His fingers tightened around hers for just a moment before he released her and began pushing the chair again. But something had shifted between them again, deepened. They bought cheese and bread from a vendor, and the Duke insisted on getting Eleanor hot cider from a woman with a brazier. He stood beside her wheelchair while she drank it, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair, and Eleanor realized how natural this felt. How right. Not the marriage she'd expected, but perhaps something better. On the way home, Eleanor worked up the courage to ask something that had been bothering her. That night, our wedding night. "Why didn't you—" "That is, I know it's a husband's right to—" She stopped, flustered, heat rising to her cheeks. "To claim his marital rights." The Duke's tone was dry. "Because I'm not an animal, Eleanor. You barely knew me. You were frightened enough without adding that to it. I decided I would wait until you were comfortable with me, until you wanted me, not just accepted your duty." Eleanor's heart was beating very fast. "And if that never happens?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Then it never happens. I married you for companionship, not a bedmate, though I won't pretend I don't want you. I do, but only when you want me in return." The admission hung in the air between them. Eleanor's face felt like it was on fire, but she forced herself to say, "I'm beginning to think I might. Want you, I mean. Someday, when I'm ready." The Duke's hands tightened on the reins. "Eleanor, I just wanted you to know that it's not that I find you repulsive or frightening. I just need time, to trust, to be certain. Take all the time you need." His voice was strained, and Eleanor wondered if this conversation was as difficult for him as it was for her. "I can wait." Christmas came to Blackmore with unexpected warmth. Eleanor had worried the holiday would be somber, but the Duke surprised her by allowing the servants to decorate the manor. Holly and ivy appeared on mantels and doorways. A massive Yule log was brought in for the Great Hall's enormous fireplace. On Christmas Eve, the Duke presented Eleanor with a gift wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. "For your music compositions," he explained. "Hartford mentioned you'd been writing down melodies. I thought you might want something proper to record them in." Eleanor was stunned. She'd been scribbling tunes in the margins of old household accounts, not thinking anyone would notice or care. "You asked Hartford about what I was doing. I wanted to get you something you'd actually use, not just some trinket." He looked uncomfortable with her surprise. "Is it acceptable?" "It's perfect." Eleanor clutched the journal to her chest. "Thank you. I have something for you as well, though it's not as thoughtful." She'd asked Mrs. Thorne to help her knit a scarf, a painstaking process given her limited mobility, but she'd been determined. The result was imperfect, with a few dropped stitches and uneven tension, but she'd made it herself. She handed it to the Duke, nervously. He unfolded it slowly, running his fingers over the wool. "You made this. I know it's not very good. It's the best gift anyone's ever given me." He wrapped it around his neck immediately, despite being indoors by a roaring fire. "Thank you, Eleanor." They spent Christmas Day quietly together. The Duke read aloud to her from a book of poetry. He had a good voice for it, deep and steady. Eleanor played the pianoforte, which had indeed been tuned, and the Duke sat nearby listening with an expression of such contentment that Eleanor's heart ached. In the evening they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. At some point the Duke moved his chair closer to hers, close enough that she could feel his warmth. When he reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, Eleanor didn't pull away. "This is nice," she said softly. "This quiet, this peace." "Yes," the Duke agreed. "I never thought I'd enjoy sharing my space with someone, but with you, it feels right." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at the way his rough palm cradled hers so carefully. "I was so frightened when I came here. I thought I was being sent to my doom. And now I think I might be happy. Happier than I've been since before my accident, perhaps happier than I've ever been." The Duke turned to look at her, his dark eyes intense. "I want to tell you something, about why I really married you." Eleanor's breath caught. "You said it was practical, for heirs, and that was part of it, but not all." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. 5 years ago, there was a ball in London. I attended only because my mother had recently died and society expected me to make an appearance. I was miserable, wanting only to leave, and then I saw you. 5 years ago, but I was 17. That was before my accident. Yes, you were dancing with some young pup who clearly didn't appreciate you, but what caught my attention was what happened after the dance. You saw one of the servants drop a tray, and while everyone else laughed or ignored it, you went to help her. You got down on your knees in your expensive dress and helped her pick up the pieces, and when another lady made a cruel comment about clumsy servants, you defended her, quietly but firmly. Eleanor had a vague memory of that night, of the dancing and the dropped tray, but she'd never known anyone was watching. "I don't understand, that was when I first noticed you. I thought you were extraordinary, kind in a way most society ladies aren't. I watched you the rest of that evening, saw how you treated everyone with respect, how you actually listened when people spoke to you. I wanted to approach you, but I knew my reputation would frighten you. And besides, you were so young, so full of life. What could I offer you?" Eleanor's heart was pounding. "So you just walked away?" "I watched from a distance. I kept track of you through social gossip. I knew when you had your accident. I knew when suitor after suitor rejected you. I knew when your father faced financial ruin." He held her gaze steadily, "and I knew it was finally my chance. I could help your family and I could have you. The woman who'd captivated me with a single act of kindness 5 years ago. You've wanted me all this time." Eleanor could barely process it. "I told myself it was just fascination, that seeing you again would break the spell. But when you arrived here, when you faced your fear and showed such courage, I knew I'd been fooling myself. I didn't want just any practical arrangement, I wanted you." Eleanor couldn't speak. All this time she thought she was the desperate one, the one who'd needed saving, but he'd wanted her. Specifically her. Not despite her wheelchair, not as a charitable act, but because 5 years ago he'd seen something in her that mattered to him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked, because it would have sounded like pretty lies. What woman would believe that a man married her out of genuine desire when she'd been rejected by everyone else? I thought if I showed you through actions, the modifications to the house, the wheelchair, treating you as an equal, you might come to understand, might come to trust me, might eventually feel something for me in return. Eleanor reached up and touched his scarred face, the first time she'd dared to touch him so intimately. He went very still, his breath catching. I already feel something for you. I've been fighting it because I didn't think you could want me. But if what you're saying is true, it's true. Every word. He caught her hand, pressed it more firmly against his cheek. Eleanor, I've wanted you for 5 years. Wanted to know you, to talk to you, to have you in my life. This marriage may have started as a transaction to you, but to me, it was a dream finally coming true. The revelation was overwhelming. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know what to say. Say you'll give me a chance, a real chance. Say you'll let yourself feel whatever you're feeling without fear. I know I'm not the husband you would have chosen. I'm difficult and stern and socially hopeless. But I will cherish you, Eleanor. I already do. The last of Eleanor's reservations crumbled. This difficult, complicated man had been carrying feelings for her for 5 years. He'd modified his entire home for her comfort, had commissioned special equipment, had been patient and kind despite his awkward nature. He'd chosen her, wanted her, waited for her. I do feel something for you, Eleanor admitted, her voice shaking. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself from disappointment, but I can't help it. When you're kind to your tenants, when you push my wheelchair yourself, when you sit and listen to me play music, when you let me see the real you beneath the harsh exterior, I feel my heart opening to you despite all my efforts to keep it closed. Eleanor. He said her name like a prayer, like something precious. May I kiss you? A real kiss, not the mockery from our wedding. In answer, Eleanor leaned forward, closing the distance between their chairs. The Duke met her halfway, his scarred hand cupping her face with exquisite gentleness. When his lips touched hers, it was soft, careful, almost reverent. Nothing like the passion she'd heard other women whisper about, but beautiful in its tenderness. When they parted, both were breathing hard. The Duke rested his forehead against hers. I've imagined that for 5 years. Was it worth the wait? Beyond my wildest dreams. He pulled back just enough to look at her. I want to do this properly. I want to court you, even though we're already married. I want to give you the romance and attention you deserve. I don't need grand gestures or flowery speeches, Eleanor said, touching his face again, tracing the line of his scar. I just need you, honest and real the way you've been with me. That's worth more than any courtship ritual. You're extraordinary, he whispered. I don't deserve you. Then it's fortunate that I married you anyway. They kissed again, longer this time, and Eleanor felt something ignite in her chest. Not just affection or gratitude, but genuine desire. She wanted him, this stern, scarred man who'd waited 5 years and modified his entire home just to make her comfortable. This man who saw her not as damaged goods but as someone worth wanting. When they finally pulled apart, the Duke stood and scooped Eleanor from her wheelchair with surprising ease, settling her in his lap in his chair. She gasped at the sudden movement, at the intimacy of being held so close. Is this all right? He asked, his arms secure around her. Yes, Eleanor breathed. More than all right. She rested her head against his shoulder, felt his heart beating against her ear. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, both finally admitting what had been growing between them. The fire burned low while they sat together, talking softly. The Duke told her more about the night he'd first seen her, about how he'd thought of her over the years. Eleanor told him about her accident, about the pain and fear and gradual acceptance. They shared histories and hopes, fears and dreams, all the things they should have said weeks ago, but hadn't been brave enough to voice. When the clock struck midnight, the Duke carried Eleanor to her chambers, but at the door he set her gently in her wheelchair, rather than following her inside. I want you to be certain, he said, his voice rough with restrained desire. I want you to have time to think about what I've told you, to decide if this is truly what you want. I've waited 5 years. I can wait a little longer. Eleanor caught his hand before he could leave. And if I am certain? If I don't want to wait? He groaned. Don't tempt me, Eleanor. I'm trying to be honorable. I don't want honor right now. I want you. She pulled him closer, rising slightly from her chair to kiss him again. I've been certain for weeks. I just didn't know if you wanted me. But now I know, and I don't want to wait anymore. The Duke looked at her with such intensity that Eleanor felt it like a physical touch. You're sure, truly sure? I'm sure. He lifted her from her wheelchair and carried her into her chambers, kicking the door closed behind them. What followed was tender and passionate, and nothing like the cold transaction Eleanor had once feared. The Duke was reverent, patient, making sure she was comfortable and willing at every stage. He worshipped her body with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes, showing her without words that he found her beautiful, desirable, perfect. Afterward, they lay tangled together in her bed, Eleanor's head on the Duke's chest, his arms around her. "I love you," he said quietly. "I've loved you since that night at the ball, even though I didn't understand it then. I love your courage and your kindness and your strength. I love how you face each day with dignity, despite everything you've endured. I love your laugh and your sharp wit and the way you play the pianoforte. I love everything about you, Eleanor." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I love you too. I didn't think I could. I was so afraid of being hurt, of giving my heart to someone who might not want it. But you've shown me every day that I can trust you, that you see me as I really am and love me anyway. Not anyway, because of who you are, all of who you are." He kissed her forehead. "You're my Duchess, my wife, my love, and I will spend every day of my life proving to you that you made the right choice in accepting me." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely of circumstances. The new year brought a confidence to Eleanor's step, or rather to her movements, that had been absent before. She moved through Blackmore Manor now as its true mistress, no longer tentative or uncertain. She consulted with Hertford about household matters, met with the housekeeper to discuss menus and supplies, took an active interest in the estate's management. The Duke encouraged this, seeming pleased to have a true partner rather than an ornamental wife. He consulted her on decisions, valued her opinions, included her in discussions with his steward. Eleanor discovered she had a talent for estate management, for seeing practical solutions to problems. Together they made a formidable team. But it was the personal moments Eleanor treasured most. The mornings when the Duke joined her for breakfast and lingered over coffee, talking about their plans for the day. The afternoons when he would find her in the library or music room and simply sit with her, content in her presence. The evenings when he read aloud to her or listened to her play, his hand warm in hers. And the nights. Oh, the nights were a revelation. The Duke was a passionate but tender lover, always mindful of her comfort and limitations, always making sure she felt cherished and desired. He proved repeatedly that her wheelchair didn't diminish her as a woman, didn't make her less capable of passion or pleasure. One cold February morning, a letter arrived that changed everything. Eleanor was in the morning room when Hertford brought it to her, marked with her father's seal. With shaking hands, she opened it. Her father's careful script covered 2 pages, and as Eleanor read, tears began streaming down her face. The Duke found her like that, weeping over the letter. He was beside her instantly, kneeling by her wheelchair. "Eleanor, what's wrong? What's happened?" "Nothing's wrong," she laughed through her tears. "Read it, please." He took the letter from her trembling hands and read aloud. "My dearest Eleanor, I write to you with news I can scarcely believe myself. The Duke's generosity has transformed our entire situation. Not only has he cleared all our debts, but he has also invested in several ventures on our behalf. Your sisters now have substantial dowries. Your mother no longer worries constantly, and I have been able to make improvements to the estate I'd only dreamed of. But more than the financial security, what moves me to write is this. I have heard from multiple sources about your happiness. Lady Hartley wrote to your mother describing a visit she made to Blackmore, where she saw you and the Duke together. She said she'd never seen a couple more devoted to one another, that the way His Grace looks at you would melt the coldest heart. Eleanor, my darling girl, I cannot tell you what it means to know that you are not only safe, but truly happy. I have carried such guilt over asking you to make this marriage. I feared I'd condemned you to misery for the sake of our family's finances. But now I understand that perhaps Providence was at work. You have found not just security but love, and with a man who values you as you deserve. I am humbled and grateful beyond words. Your mother sends her love, as do your sisters. We all hope to visit Blackmore in the spring if His Grace will permit it. With deepest affection and pride, your father. The Duke lowered the letter, his expression unreadable. Your father thinks I've made you happy. You have. Eleanor caught his hand. You've made me happier than I ever imagined possible. Lady Hartley visited last month. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. She made some pointed comments about you, about your condition. Eleanor remembered the visit. Lady Hartley had been one of those society women who mixed sweetness with cruelty, who said cutting things while maintaining a veneer of concern. She'd asked Eleanor numerous invasive questions about her affliction and whether the Duke found it terribly inconvenient. I remember. She was horrid. She was worse than horrid. The Duke's voice went cold in a way Eleanor hadn't heard in months. After you left the room, she suggested that I must find our marriage challenging, given your limitations. She implied that any man would naturally seek companionship elsewhere. Eleanor's stomach clenched. What did you say? I informed her that she was never to set foot in Blackmore again, that if she ever spoke about you in such terms to anyone, I would ensure her husband's business ventures failed and her family became social pariahs. He met Eleanor's eyes. I may have been somewhat more explicit in my language than was strictly polite. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. You threatened to destroy her entire family? She insulted my wife. I'm not known for my restraint when it comes to protecting what's mine. But his expression softened, though apparently my rage was so obvious that even Lady Hartley could see I was defending you out of genuine devotion rather than simply pride. Thus her letter to your mother. Eleanor pulled him closer, kissed him soundly. My fierce, protective husband. What did I ever do to deserve you? That's my line, he murmured against her lips. You're the extraordinary one. I'm just the fortunate bastard who managed to marry you. Such language, Your Grace. You bring out my baser instincts. He kissed her again, deeper this time. Among other things. They were interrupted by Hertford clearing his throat pointedly from the doorway. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Pemberton has arrived and insists on seeing you immediately. Eleanor felt the Duke tense. Pemberton? What the hell does he want? Lord Pemberton, the man who'd fled from Ashford Hall the moment he'd seen Eleanor's wheelchair, the coward who'd had an urgent appointment rather than sit through tea with a crippled woman. Eleanor felt her own temper rise. I'll see him in my study, the Duke said coldly, rising to his feet. Eleanor, you don't need to. I'm coming with you. Eleanor's voice was steel. I want to hear what he has to say. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. But if he says anything that upsets you, I'm throwing him out bodily. Lord Pemberton was pacing the study when they entered, his expression anxious. He stopped when he saw Eleanor, and his face went pale. Miss Ashford, Your Grace, I didn't realize— What do you want, Pemberton? The Duke's voice could have cut glass. Your Grace, I've come to apologize. To both of you. Pemberton looked genuinely distressed. I've heard about your marriage, about how devoted you are to the Duchess, and I realized what a complete fool I'd been last year when I called at Ashford Hall. You ran like a coward the moment you saw my wheelchair, Eleanor said flatly. Couldn't even stay for tea. I know. I'm ashamed of myself. Pemberton met her eyes and she saw genuine remorse there. I was shallow and stupid. I let one aspect of who you were blind me to everything else. And now I see that the Duke of Blackmore, one of the most powerful and discerning men in England, recognized your worth when I couldn't. I'm sorry, Your Grace, truly sorry. The Duke stepped forward, his posture menacing. You think an apology erases the insult? You think saying you're sorry makes up for the fact that you treated my wife like she was damaged goods? No, Your Grace. Nothing can make up for it. Pemberton stood his ground, despite clearly being terrified. But I wanted you both to know that I regret my actions. I've been dining out on my connection to your family, telling anyone who'll listen about my brush with the Duchess of Blackmore, and I realized what a hypocrite that made me, given how I'd treated her when she was Miss Ashford. Eleanor studied the man who'd once represented all of society's rejection, all the pain of being found wanting. He looked older somehow, diminished, and she realized something surprising. She didn't care. His opinion didn't matter. His regret didn't matter. She had a husband who loved her, a home where she was valued, a life that was fuller and richer than anything she could have had with him. I accept your apology, Lord Pemberton, she said calmly, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because holding on to anger over your actions gives you too much importance in my life. You're irrelevant to me now. Your opinion was irrelevant then, though I didn't realize it at the time. The Duke moved to stand behind her wheelchair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders in a gesture of support and possession. My wife is more generous than I am. I suggest you leave before I decide that throwing you out is worth the satisfaction. Pemberton nodded, backing toward the door. Thank you, Your Grace, both of you. I won't trouble you again. When he was gone, Eleanor reached up and covered one of the Duke's hands with her own. That felt surprisingly good. You were magnificent, cold and regal and utterly dismissive. He'll be dining out on that rejection for months. The Duke bent to kiss the top of her head. I wanted to hit him. I know. That's why I handled it. He wasn't worth your violence. You're not angry that I threatened to throw him out? I'm flattered that you wanted to defend me, though I can defend myself quite well, as you saw. The Duke came around to face her, kneeling again so they were eye level. Do you know how proud I am of you? How constantly amazed I am by your strength? I learned it from you. You taught me that being strong doesn't mean pretending nothing hurts. It means acknowledging the hurt and moving forward anyway. He kissed her then, and Eleanor thought about how far they'd both come, from strangers bound by necessity to partners bound by love, from isolation to intimacy, from fear to trust. Spring arrived at Blackmoor with a violence of colour that stunned Eleanor. The moors that had been so austere and grey all winter suddenly erupted with wildflowers. Purple heather, yellow gorse, white cotton grass, the landscape transformed into something almost magical. The Duke had more modifications made to the grounds, adding even more accessible paths, so Eleanor could explore the full beauty of the estate. They spent hours outdoors together, the Duke often walking beside her wheelchair as they explored. He showed her his favourite spots, a hidden valley where deer came to drink, a rise where you could see for miles across the moors, a small wood where bluebells grew in profusion. One particularly beautiful May afternoon, they were in the rose garden, when the Duke suddenly said, I need to take you to London. Eleanor looked up in surprise. London? Why? Because you've been buried at Blackmoor all winter, and I want to show the world what an extraordinary duchess I have. Because you deserve to be seen and celebrated, not hidden away. Because, he paused, because I want everyone to see us together and know that I'm the most fortunate man in England. You hate London, Eleanor reminded him. I hate London society and its superficiality, but for you I'll endure it. Besides, it's time I stopped hiding from the world. Time I stopped letting people think I'm some kind of monster who mistreats his wife. You want to parade me around society? Eleanor was torn between amusement and trepidation. You realize that will invite scrutiny, comments. People will stare at my wheelchair, will gossip about us, will say terrible things. Let them. The Duke's expression was fierce. Let them see how I look at you, how I treat you. Let them see that a wheelchair doesn't diminish your worth or your beauty or your intelligence. Let them see that I married you not out of pity, but out of genuine desire, and that I consider myself blessed beyond measure to have you. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. You want to show me off. I want the world to know what they lost when they rejected you. I want every man who turned you away to see what they missed, and I want you to hold your head high in the society that once made you feel invisible. It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Eleanor thought of all those years of being wheeled into corners at parties, of being ignored and pitied and dismissed. The thought of returning to that world with the Duke beside her as his wife, as his equal. It was intoxicating. Very well, she said. Let's go to London. Let's show them. 2 weeks later, they arrived in London for the season. The Duke's townhouse was in Mayfair, smaller than Blackmoor Manor, but still impressively grand, and like Blackmoor, it had been modified. The Duke had clearly sent instructions ahead, because Eleanor found ramps and widened doorways and a ground-floor bedroom suite that allowed her to access everything she needed. Their first major appearance was at a ball hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire. As their carriage pulled up to the magnificent house, Eleanor felt her courage falter. What if they're cruel? What if they say terrible things? The Duke took her hand. Then I will respond in kind, and we will leave. But Eleanor, I suspect you underestimate the impact you're going to have. You're beautiful, intelligent, and now you're a duchess. You outrank most of the people in that ballroom. Let them dare to mock you. The ballroom fell silent when they were announced. Every eye turned to stare at the Duke of Blackmoor and his Duchess. Eleanor, dressed in a stunning gown of deep emerald silk, sat regally in her wheelchair, while the Duke stood behind her, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. The whispers started immediately. Eleanor could see it rippling through the crowd, the gossip, the speculation, the judgment. But something had changed. She wasn't the pitied Miss Ashford anymore. She was the Duchess of Blackmoor, wife to one of the most powerful men in England. And the way the Duke was looking at her, with such obvious pride and devotion, made it impossible for anyone to think this was a marriage of charity. Lady Hartley approached first, the woman who'd made those cruel comments at Blackmoor. She stopped a respectful distance away, her expression wary. Your Grace, how lovely to see you in London. The Duke's hand tightened on Eleanor's shoulder, but his voice was coldly polite. Lady Hartley, I'm surprised to see you speaking to us given our previous conversation. I've had time to reflect on my behavior, Your Grace. I wanted to apologize to the Duchess. She turned to Eleanor. I was thoughtless and cruel. You deserved better. Eleanor inclined her head graciously. Apology accepted, Lady Hartley. We all make mistakes. The measure of character is whether we learn from them. It was a masterful response, accepting the apology while also implying that Lady Hartley's behavior had been a mistake rather than a revelation of her true character. The woman flushed but nodded gratefully and retreated. As the evening progressed, more people approached. Some were genuine in their greetings, others clearly curious. But throughout it all, the Duke never left Eleanor's side. When someone suggested she might prefer to sit in a quieter corner, he coldly replied that his wife preferred to be in the center of things where she belonged. When a gentleman looked doubtful about approaching, the Duke called him over and introduced him to Eleanor, making it clear she was to be treated as any other lady of rank. The pivotal moment came when the orchestra began playing a waltz. Couples took to the floor, and Eleanor felt the familiar pang of loss. This was what her accident had taken from her: the joy of dancing, the romance of being swept around a ballroom in someone's arms. The Duke moved to stand in front of her wheelchair. "Dance with me." Eleanor stared at him. "I can't dance, you know that." "Dance with me anyway." He held out his hands, and when Eleanor took them, he lifted her from her wheelchair with easy strength, cradling her against his chest, one arm supporting her back, the other under her knees. He carried her onto the dance floor. The ballroom went absolutely silent. Everyone stopped dancing, stopped talking, stopped moving. All eyes were on the Duke of Blackmore and his Duchess. And then he began to dance. He moved in a slow waltz, holding Eleanor securely in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. It wasn't traditional dancing. She wasn't on her feet, couldn't follow the steps, but he swept her around the floor with such grace and confidence that it didn't matter. He was dancing for both of them, and the way he held her, the way he looked at her, made it clear that this was the only woman he wanted in his arms. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy. He was dancing with her, despite the stares, despite breaking every rule of propriety, despite his hatred of being the center of attention. He was dancing with her because he knew how much she missed it. When the music ended, the Duke didn't immediately set her down. He stood in the center of the ballroom holding his wife and looked around with such cold challenge in his eyes that no one dared make a sound. Then he carried Eleanor back to her wheelchair and carefully settled her into it, his movements tender and reverent. The applause started slowly, one person, then another, then suddenly the entire ballroom was clapping. Not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine appreciation for what they'd just witnessed. Some of the ladies were crying. Even the men looked moved. The Duke ignored them all. He leaned down to Eleanor and whispered, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfect," Eleanor whispered back, her face wet with tears. "That was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. You deserve 1,000 dances, 1,000 moments of beauty. I'll give them to you, every one I can." The rest of the evening was a blur of introductions and conversations, but the dance had changed something. People no longer looked at Eleanor with pity or curiosity. They looked at her with respect, with warmth, with recognition that she was loved by a powerful man who thought she was worth bending every rule of society for. When they finally returned home, exhausted but exhilarated, the Duke carried Eleanor up to their bedroom. "That was either the best idea I've ever had or the most scandalous thing I'll ever do." "It was perfect," Eleanor said, pulling him down for a kiss. "You made me feel like a princess. No, like a beloved wife. That's all I ever want you to feel." He began unlacing her gown with practiced ease. "I should probably apologize for making such a spectacle." "Don't you dare apologize. Every girl who's ever been rejected or overlooked needed to see that tonight. You showed them that being different doesn't mean being less." The Duke paused in his task of undressing her, meeting her eyes. "You showed them that. I just made sure they were paying attention." They made love that night with a passion and tenderness that spoke of everything they'd been through together, from strangers bound by necessity to partners bound by love, from isolation to intimacy, from fear to absolute trust. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Eleanor said quietly, "I never thought I could be this happy. I never thought anyone would want me the way you do. I never thought I'd find someone who could see past my reputation and my scars to the man underneath. Someone who wouldn't try to change me or civilize me, but would accept me as I am." He kissed her forehead. "We're both lucky, Eleanor. We found each other when neither of us was looking." The London season passed in a whirl of social events. The Duke and Duchess of Blackmore became one of the most talked-about couples in society, not because of scandal, but because of their obvious devotion to each other. The story of their dance spread through every drawing room and club in London, becoming the romantic moment of the season. Invitations poured in, and though the Duke still hated social events, he attended them for Eleanor's sake. She, in turn, made sure they didn't stay too long at any one event, knowing his patience for society was limited. They found a rhythm that worked for both of them. Eleanor also reconnected with her family. Her father visited frequently, clearly relieved to see his daughter so happy. Her sisters came to stay, full of questions about married life and romantic notions about the Duke, who they now saw as some kind of heroic figure rather than the fearsome man they'd imagined. On a warm June afternoon, Eleanor sat in the garden of the London townhouse with her youngest sister Alice, watching the Duke speak with their father across the lawn. "He really loves you," Alice said, her voice full of wonder. "The way he looks at you, it's like you're the only person in the world." "I feel the same way about him," Eleanor admitted. "I know it's not fashionable to love one's husband, but I can't help it. Do you remember that ball, years ago, before your accident, when you helped that servant?" Alice was watching the Duke with curious eyes. "Vaguely. Why?" "I was with you. I remember now. There was a man standing in the shadows watching. He looked so intense, so focused on you. I remember thinking he looked dangerous." Alice turned to Eleanor. "I think that was him. I think the Duke was watching you even then." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "He told me he saw me that night, that it was the moment he first noticed me." "He's been in love with you for years, hasn't he?" Alice's voice was soft, waiting for his chance. "That's so romantic, Eleanor, like something from a novel." "It's better than a novel. It's real." Eleanor watched her husband laugh at something her father said, saw the genuine warmth in his expression. This man who was so cold to most of the world was warm with her family because they were important to her. "I'm so lucky, Alice. I know that sounds strange given everything I've lost, but I truly am lucky." "You're not lucky. You're loved. That's better." That evening, after Eleanor's family had left and the servants had retired, the Duke found Eleanor in the music room. She was playing softly, one of the melodies she'd composed, her fingers moving over the keys with practiced grace. He sat beside her on the bench and simply listened. When she finished, he took her hand and said, "I have something to tell you, something I've been thinking about for weeks." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What is it?" "I want to go back to Blackmore. Soon. I've endured London society for your sake, but Eleanor, I miss our home. I miss the quiet and the wildness and the simplicity of being just us, without all these people and expectations." "I miss it too," Eleanor admitted. "London is wonderful, but it's exhausting, and I find myself wanting the privacy we had at Blackmore, the long conversations and quiet evenings. Then we'll go home." He raised her hand to his lips. "And once we're there, I want to focus on our future, on building the life we want together, away from society's scrutiny and expectations." Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying. They'd been married for months now, and though they'd never explicitly discussed it, the possibility of children hung unspoken between them. Eleanor's doctors had warned her that pregnancy might be complicated given her injury, but they hadn't said it was impossible. "I want that too," she said softly. "Whatever future we can build together. Children or no children, I want it all with you." The Duke pulled her close and they sat together on the piano bench, holding each other. "I love you, Eleanor, more than I thought possible to love anyone. You've transformed my life, brought light and warmth to places I'd thought would always be cold." "You've given me back my life," Eleanor said. "You've shown me that I'm not defined by my limitations, that I can be wanted and valued and loved. You've given me freedom and partnership and passion. I love you too, so very much." They returned to Blackmore in early July, and the manor welcomed them like an old friend. Eleanor had thought London would change how she felt about the remote estate, might make it seem oppressive again. Instead, it felt like coming home. The summer at Blackmore was peaceful and perfect. They rode out over the moors together in the specially modified carriage. They spent evenings in the library, reading or simply talking. The Duke showed Eleanor the business of running the estate, teaching her everything he knew, treating her as a true partner in all things. And yes, they talked about children, about the risks and possibilities, about what they would do if Eleanor became pregnant, about their hopes and fears. It was intimate and frightening and hopeful all at once. "Whatever happens, we face it together," the Duke said one night as they lay in bed, Eleanor's head on his chest. "If we have children, wonderful. If we don't, we'll still have each other. That's enough for me." It's enough for me too, Eleanor agreed, though I confess I'd love to give you an heir, to see what our children would be like. Your strength combined with my— What? Stubbornness? The Duke laughed. Your intelligence, your kindness, your courage. Yes, I'd love that too. But Eleanor, you've already given me more than I ever dreamed of having. A partner who understands me, who accepts me, who makes me want to be better. That's worth more than any heir. 2 years after their wedding, Eleanor sat in the gardens of Blackmore Manor, watching her husband play with their daughter. Lady Catherine Blackmore was just over a year old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's smile. She was crawling determinedly across the grass toward a butterfly, making the Duke laugh as he followed her progress with obvious pride. Eleanor's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where another child grew. The doctors had been shocked when she'd become pregnant the first time, warning of all the risks. But Eleanor had been determined, and the Duke had supported her through every moment of fear and uncertainty. Catherine's birth had been difficult, but ultimately triumphant, and now they were preparing to do it all again. Mrs. Thorne appeared with tea, settling the tray on the table beside Eleanor. "She's going to tire his grace out," the older woman said with a smile, watching the Duke crawl after his daughter. "He doesn't seem to mind," Eleanor observed. The fearsome Duke of Blackmore, who terrified grown men with a glance, was currently making ridiculous faces to make his daughter giggle. It was the most wonderful contradiction. The Duke caught Catherine and lifted her high, making her squeal with delight. Then he carried her over to Eleanor, settling the wiggly child in her mother's lap. "She's determined to catch that butterfly. I think she has your stubbornness." "My stubbornness?" Eleanor laughed, cuddling their daughter close. "I seem to recall you spending an entire winter modifying a wheelchair because you were too stubborn to admit defeat. That's persistence, not stubbornness. There's a difference. Whatever you need to tell yourself, darling." The Duke settled on the ground beside Eleanor's wheelchair, something he did often, apparently content to sit at her level rather than tower over her. He watched Catherine play with Eleanor's fingers, his expression soft with love. "Do you remember that first day?" Eleanor asked quietly. "When I arrived here, so frightened I could barely breathe. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, coming to marry a man with my reputation, knowing you had no choice yet holding your head high." He met her eyes. "I remember wanting to tell you right then that you had nothing to fear from me, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to show you I wanted to cherish you, not hurt you. You showed me through actions. The wheelchair, the modifications to the house, the way you were patient with me, even when you clearly found social interaction difficult." Eleanor touched his face, traced the scar she'd come to love. "You showed me every day that you valued me." "I loved you," he corrected. "From that night at the ball, I loved you. I just didn't know how to say it in a way you'd believe." Catherine grabbed at her father's hand and he let her pull his fingers into her mouth, clearly unbothered by the indignity. Eleanor watched them together and felt her heart swell with gratitude. This life, this family, this love had seemed impossible 2 years ago. She'd thought she was being condemned to a loveless marriage, to a life of isolation and cold tolerance. Instead, she'd found a partner who saw her as she truly was, a man who'd waited years for the chance to marry her, who'd modified his entire home to make her comfortable, who danced with her in a ballroom full of judging eyes just to give her back a moment of joy. A man who looked at her wheelchair and saw only a detail, not a definition. "What are you thinking?" the Duke asked, watching her expression. "That I'm happy, truly, completely happy. That despite everything, the accident, the rejections, the fear, I wouldn't change a single thing if it meant not ending up here with you." The Duke leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and sweet, mindful of their daughter between them. "I feel the same. Every dark moment of my life was worth it because it led me to you." Catherine made an indignant noise at being ignored, and they both laughed. The Duke lifted her again, standing to swing her in circles while she shrieked with delight. Eleanor watched them, her hand on her belly where their second child grew, and thought about how wrong she'd been about everything. She'd thought her accident had ruined her life, had made her unwanted and unlovable, but instead it had brought her here, to this remote manor on the wild moors, to this difficult, wonderful man who loved her with a fierce devotion, to this life that was richer and fuller than anything she'd imagined in her youth. The wheelchair that society had seen as a mark of shame had become irrelevant in the face of genuine love. The Duke didn't see her as crippled or damaged. He saw her as Eleanor, his wife, his partner, his equal, the mother of his children, the love of his life. And in his eyes she had finally learned to see herself the same way. Everyone refused her, people used to whisper. The Colonel's crippled daughter. But they'd been wrong about what that meant. Yes, society had rejected her. Yes, she'd been overlooked and dismissed and pitied. But all of that had brought her to the Duke of Blackmore, who'd been waiting for her with a devotion that transcended every limitation society tried to impose. He hadn't seen her as broken. He'd seen her as she truly was. Extraordinary, brave, worthy of love. And in loving her, he'd given her back something she'd lost in that fall from a horse years ago. Not the ability to walk, but something far more precious. The ability to see herself as whole, complete, valuable just as she was. The sun was setting over the moors now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The Duke came back to Eleanor's side, Catherine drowsy on his shoulder. He offered Eleanor his free hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Ready to go inside?" he asked softly. Eleanor looked at her family, her husband with his scarred face and tender heart. Her daughter already showing signs of inheriting both parents' determination, the child growing inside her that represented their continued hope and love. She looked at the manor that had seemed so forbidding once and now felt like home. She looked at the wild moors she'd learned to love, at the gardens made accessible just for her, at the life they'd built together from the most unlikely of beginnings. "Yes," she said, squeezing the Duke's hand. "Let's go home." And as they made their way inside, the Duke pushing Eleanor's wheelchair with one hand while carrying their sleeping daughter with the other, anyone watching would have seen not tragedy or limitation, but love. Pure, transformative, enduring love that had taken two wounded souls and healed them both. Everyone had refused her, the Colonel's crippled daughter. Everyone except the one man who mattered, the cruel Duke, they'd called him. But Eleanor knew the truth. He wasn't cruel at all. He was simply a man who'd learned that real love doesn't demand perfection. It celebrates truth. And the truth was that Eleanor Blackmore, Duchess of Blackmore, was exactly who she was meant to be, not despite her wheelchair, but simply, wholly, completely herself. And that was worth more than any fairy tale ending could ever be, because it was real.